Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a cloud solutions architect specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is an installment on Intune focused on the newly released, as of this recording, endpoint privilege management. So this is actually a really cool feature that I'm excited to talk about here. I want to say at the outset, I'll say this again as we go along, but I want to say at the outset that endpoint privilege management, it's a really cool feature. It's one that doesn't take a lot of effort to demo because it's pretty straightforward. But the implications of this thing are pretty significant, pretty huge, right? The other thing I want to make sure I say is this is a feature that is available in Intune, but it does require additional licensing. It's just now left, as of a few days ago, as of this recording, left public preview, and it's now in full production. So at this stage, it does require additional licensing to use. But let's go ahead and jump in, right? So here's the flow of what we're going to talk about today in this session. So what is this thing that I'm talking about called endpoint privilege management? Really, what it is the ability to have a standard user running or logged into their system and then giving selective ability to elevate applications or whatever you want, right, on that system so that the user can do those things, right? So there's a lot of potential scenarios for this. I'll save the scenario discussion for a little bit later, but there are quite a few, and I want to say it now, but I'll wait, right? The other thing I want to say here as well, because I don't want to forget to say it, is when I get to the demo part, you're going to see that the application I've chosen to elevate is the command prompt. I did it for two reasons. One, it's easy, and then two, it does facilitate me being able to get to a couple of areas on the system that I want to show you while I'm logged in as a standard user. So it also illustrates, the elevation is actually in place on the system, right? So I'll show that. I do not recommend that in a production environment. In fact, one of the things that you'll hear me say again is when you decide to elevate, be very, very aware of what the side benefits potentially of that elevation are. So certainly elevating the command prompt, not a good idea because it will give unfettered ability to launch other applications then under admin rights and different things, right? So be very careful about what you elevate. All right, so why do we care about endpoint privilege management? Well, in a zero trust world, it does give us the ability to have that broad user base and perform with a least privilege kind of mentality while still allowing focused areas where we can elevate. So one little tangent here. So there's a couple of customers I work with, and they have users that have two user accounts, one for their standard day-to-day practice on their desktop, and another for those limited purpose, we need extra rights kind of sign-ins where they do have that extra privilege. And so something like this would enable that scenario to be simplified. And instead of having two user accounts that need to be managed, we can do it with one and simply elevate where it makes sense to elevate, which is what you have the second user account for, and just maintain with one. So it does help you fulfill the zero trust capability. Very granular controls, as we'll see. The controls for endpoint privilege management are broken down into either settings or rules. And how we use those, we'll talk about when we actually get to that section. And then there's reports that, honestly, I don't think you're going to see any data in mine just because I think I know why, but the reports are there and they should be active at this stage, but I don't think you're going to see any data in mine, but I'll show the reports to you anyway. All right, so what are the requirements? Well, you do need Intune. It's a feature of Intune, and you do need the appropriate licensing. You also need to make sure your operating system is at least the level shown on the screen. So if you are not there, it doesn't mean that endpoint privilege management will give you an error. What will happen instead is when you apply the settings, it'll come back as not applicable, right? And I actually, when I was setting this up in my lab, I actually thought that I was good. I looked at my OS and I went, well, that matches, right? But then I applied the settings that came back as not applicable. So I realized I was missing something, and I was. So be extra careful to make sure that you are at least the levels on the screen. Coverage for Windows 10 and 11, but make sure you're at a supported OS or higher, right? There are network requirements that are documented, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time just showing you network requirements here, but just know there are some additional network requirements in addition to what's needed for Intune, right? And then in terms of what do we support, what kind of machines do we support, as long as they're hybrid or pure Azure AD joined, we'll support it, no problem at all. There are scenarios sometimes where you can be workplace joined and you're neither hybrid or pure Azure AD joined. That's a scenario that shouldn't be really anyway, and it's not a scenario that we support at all with endpoint privilege management. So then finally, what are those scenarios? So I mentioned there are a few. These are a few that we document. Perhaps there's a situation where you want to allow application installs. That probably, maybe not be likely, right? Most of the time, customers will use a managed application such as a config manager or an Intune or whatever to do application installs. It could be a scenario where there's a one-off scenario or whatever that you want to allow application installs. Could be allowing driver updates. So that's a discussion I got into with one of my customers where they had maybe a scenario with users that are remote and they needed to do driver updates and maybe allow that in some cases for troubleshooting or whatever else. Sure, yeah, that can be done, right? No problem. There was another discussion brought up where maybe the user is not able to get in to the corporate environment, so the normal typical tools that IT would use to reach out to those machines are not really available. There are tools in Intune that would work regardless, but still, going with that scenario, would this work to elevate temporarily, help the help desk be able to get the user set back up and then be able to take those privileges away? Yes, that would be a scenario, right? Windows diagnostics, being able to run those, that would be a scenario. More things that you probably could dream up that might be fitting into a given scenario. There could be scenarios I had with one customer where there was a particular diagnostic tool. It was a diagnostic tool that would require admin rights and would typically require a help desk visit to run. And so as I was showing them this feature, they thought, well, that would be a really cool scenario to reduce the number of help desk visits, simply give the rights to run this elevated tool. And then there were some other things as well. So the scenarios that could possibly come to bear are myriad, and it's just a matter of your needs, your business, whatever. But there's a lot of power in here as you start to unpack and think about it. So that said, let's actually get in to seeing how we set this up. Again, this is a feature that's not tremendously difficult to demo, but the power that this feature brings is pretty significant. All right, it's pretty significant to think about once you really get into it. Right. So here's the Intune portal. So whenever we want to look at endpoint privilege management, right now it's under endpoint security. So if I look under endpoint security, here it is, endpoint privilege management. This is not where it's going to be ongoing. So at some point, unless plans change, at some point this will be under tenant administration, right? Not there now. So if you don't see it over in endpoint security, then look over in tenant administration. So here we'll just go to endpoint privilege management, and right away you're going to notice this banner that says, hey, it's now released into general availability. What that means is in order to get access to this, you're going to need to have appropriate licensing. So there's that reminder again. So right now in my tenant, it hasn't moved, but at some point it will, and maybe it already has in some tenants, right? So, all right, so let's keep going. So as we think about endpoint privilege management, the configuration really is in just a few areas. There's policies, which is where we're going to start. Then there's reusable settings, which we'll get to, and then finally there's reports, and we'll get to that as well. But let's start with policies. All right, we'll start with settings policy, and then we'll get over to this rules policy. So if I go create a policy, just so you see this, right, it's going to be, so this is Windows 10 and later, and you're only going to have a choice to create settings policy or rules policy. And this also makes me think, what you're going to see is my lab. My lab is boring. What will likely be in a production scenario will not be as simple as what's in my lab, right? And I'll explain that a little bit as we go along. But let me go to my settings policy and start to tell you what I mean. So here, I'm just going to enable endpoint privilege management, right? And so you'll see I've got a few, not applicable. I know what those are. I know what the errors are, but it is turned on. So if I go down and look at the settings that are actually configured for this, pretty easy. The first thing is, do I want endpoint privilege management to be enabled or not? Yes, right? So in a production environment, there may be a scenario where you want to explicitly deny endpoint privilege management on a set of machines. Cool. If you want to do that, just create a policy that explicitly denies it, assign it to those devices, and you're good. And then a little asterisk with assign it to devices. I'll talk to you about assignment more in just a minute, devices or users or some strategy along that. If you want to enable endpoint privilege management and you want to enable it one way for a set of devices and another way for a different set of devices, that's cool too. I would envision maybe you'll have a couple, maybe 2 or 3 EPM policies to control whether it's enabled, disabled, and how it's enabled when it is. Do I want to send elevation data for reporting? Almost certainly the answer to that will be yes, because if you're using the elevation privilege, being able to track that, really important. And then what kind of data level do I want to send for the actual use of my elevation privilege? Finally, what is my default elevation response? So default means that this is what we're going to configure. But you can override that, right? So by default, I'm going to require user confirmation. Now, this was kind of a silly drop down in my mind, right? Because if you enable endpoint privilege management by itself and you don't configure any rules, then the user is not going to be bothered. If you do configure rules, then you probably are going to want user confirmation of some sort, right? And so these two actually work the same. Deny all requested, not configured, kind of work the same. So there's really only 2 choices here. And then if you are going to do an elevation response, what are the 2 options or options do you want to include? Again, by default. So I've included both by default, but you will see in a moment that I'm only choosing one. So I can override that default option. And then I'll save that out, right? So then I will deploy that to my let me scroll up. I don't really want to save that. Then I will deploy that to my desired audience. So this is where I would talk about assignments for a minute. So when we talk about assignments, typically for an endpoint privilege management settings policy, the target would be machines, devices, right? You can assign to users. So if I edit this, you'll see that I can assign to all users. So I immediately thought about that and thought, well, is there a scenario where I might want to assign to users? And I came up with, yeah, there could be some where maybe I have certain groups of users that maybe it's help desk or field techs or whatever the case may be, that I want to assign the ability to use endpoint privilege management. And I thought, well, how would that work? Right, so I did a little bit of research, and I'll say this, right? So I'm going to be intentionally vague for a minute, but I'll say this, right? There's a component that, let me go into it a different way. So my concern was whenever you assign endpoint privilege management to a device, that policy goes down to the device right away, is implemented right away, and we're good, right? Because it's targeted to devices. All the users on that device, endpoint privilege management will be at least enabled. It doesn't mean that there's any rules applied yet, but at least the capability is enabled. If you apply to users, my concern was, well, how long is it going to take after the user logs on to actually have the policy come down and be effective, right? And so I started doing a little bit of digging. And what I found out, so there's actually, as you think about the management capabilities of Intune, there's actually two areas where those management capabilities can be applied. One is through MDM, right? That's true for the vast majority of settings. But there are certain settings that will not apply through MDM. They require the Microsoft Intune management extension. It's seamless for you. You don't know as the IT admin, unless you do. But it's a second bucket of how things get configured. So here comes the intentional vagueness. There is a third bucket that is what I refer to, and please, this is my topic. It's not probably what it's officially called. In fact, it's not. I think of it as the next generation of MDM, right? It's not, I'm not saying that's what it's called. I'm not saying MDM is going away. Please don't read that. I'm just saying it's a third vehicle by which certain settings can be applied. And with these endpoint privilege management settings come down through that vehicle. And because of that, there is no delay from the user logging on to being able to have these enabled. It's pretty darn fast. I wanted to say instantaneous. I wouldn't say it's instantaneous, but the delay is completely unnoticeable. It's so fast, right? So what does that mean? That means it is a plausible scenario that you could target your settings to users. There is a side effect of that, though, if you target the settings themselves to enable endpoint privilege management to users. And that is, when that user logs onto the machine, endpoint privilege management will be enabled. And that will be true for any machine they log on to. So once it's enabled, it stays enabled unless it's explicitly disabled, or the user logs off and there's a period of time that is idle, whatever, right? So there's some potential to cause some breadcrumbs, if you will, that you may not intend to do. So the suggestion is to implement it with device-based policy, targeting, whatever. And then user targeting is great when it comes to settings. Device targeting is great when it comes to, user targeting is great when it comes to rules. Device targeting is also great when it comes to rules, right? So, but for settings, the preference is to target by device, but you can do either. So if there's a scenario where you need to use user targeting for settings, just make sure you know the implications. So this is enabling, disabling, and configuring default behavior. Now, let's go look at what it looks like to configure a rule, right? So this is a rule that I've configured to elevate the command prompt. Again, all the appropriate cautions about elevating the command prompt. It's a bad thing to do. I did it for demo on purpose, right? You'll see why in a minute. But here it is. Pretty easy to define. And this is a weird one. It's probably because it's my lab. Machines are on and off all the time. But I just went through this, and endpoint privilege management is working just fine on the machine. This weird that it did that. Okay. So let me look at my configuration settings. So here, I have one setting defined. So here's where you would have the opportunity to decide, do I want to define a setting per, do I want to define one elevation per rule, or do I want to create a rule perhaps for a group of devices or users or whatever, so that I can do that together, and I maybe have 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 rules within one rule group. Yeah, whatever you want to do is fine. In mine, it's simple. It's my lab, so it's one rule that I've created, and we'll use that. So these are blank initially. So if I were to click add, you'll see that these are blank initially. So I'm not going to save this, but I'll show you. Here's where you edit the details to make the rule active. And so you do need a rule name. Optionally, you can provide a description. You will need to decide an elevation type. So now this one's interesting. So this also goes to the idea of, do you want to force the user to give a justification or have some interaction before the elevation happens, Or are these things that you know what, I know I need to elevate these, so I'm not going to force the user to do this extra work, right? I'm just going to automatically elevate the app when the user decides to click on it, right? Up to you how you do it. Most of the time, I would imagine scenarios where you would want to do automatic elevation, and then it's totally seamless to the user, but whichever. So I've chosen user confirmed because not doing that would make for a less than optimal demo, right? But you can choose whatever. And then notice if it's automatic, I have no additional choices because it just happens. But if it's user confirmed, then I can choose what validation options do I want. So on the default settings policy, I had both business justification and Windows authentication turned on. Here it's just business justification. So I'm overriding the default rule. So that's great. Now I'm going to specify what file information that will elevate. So here's my cmd.exe, that's required. I can provide the file path. That gives a bit more specificity, so I do like that. It's not required, but it does. There's a signature source. So this is the preferred option, right? So here, I don't have a certificate defined, but there are some options here. You can upload a cert file. You can use one that's already been created in reusable settings. We'll get there in a minute. But since I don't have a cert file, I'm just choosing not configured. If you don't choose a signature source, then you absolutely have to have a file hash, right? In fact, it's a good idea to have this anyway, right? In fact, it might be required. Let's see. Yeah, so the file hash is not required when you choose a certificate. You can have it, but it's not required if you choose a certificate. But without it, you absolutely have to have it. And getting the file hash is not hard. It's really pretty easy. It's a matter of, let me show you. Just going to go to PowerShell and run as administrator. Yes. And I'm going to say get file hash and or whatever the path is to your file. And I have the file hash. So now I can take that and put it over into here. Right? Now there's some additional options. They are not required. Minimum version gives you a bit more control to make sure the version that you're launching is at least what you expect. File description, these, as far as I haven't filled these out, but these look to be more tags for you to use. It's not probably going to give you any more granularity. But I haven't tested this, so I can't say for sure, but that's my read on it. Right? So it's that easy to go create the rules property. Right? And then now I'm going to exit that because I don't care. Now I'm going to exit this too because I don't need to save anything else. Now I can assign. Now I've chosen to assign to devices, but here you could just as easily apply to users, no problem. Right? So that enable on all the devices, but then apply your rules to users, and then when certain users log on to a device, they have access, whereas others on that device don't. Right? So pretty darn easy to configure. I'm about to go show you on a machine, but before I do, let's talk about reusable settings and reports real quick. So reusable settings is something that is relatively new in Intune. It's not everywhere. It's in certain places. I've seen it in, I think, 4 places, maybe 3. Here is one. And at first, when I saw reusable settings, I thought, well, yawn, that's whatever. I'll figure that out later. Reusable settings is actually really cool, right? It's exactly what it says. It's the idea of maybe you have some settings that you want to define and reuse them in multiple places. Define it once, reuse them in multiple places. It's a convenience. So here, and it is context specific. So what you do in a reusable settings for endpoint privilege management will not be the same things you do with other settings, right? So I can click add. I'll give it the very descriptive name and click next. And so what I'm going to be asked to do is upload a cert file, right? Why? Because you can use a cert file or multiple cert files in your library and then pick the ones you want when you're defining your rules as a level of validation. And then you can pair that with the hash if you want to. Sorry, you can pair that with the hash if you want to give 2 levels of validation. But I don't have anything defined here, so I'm going to walk away. Another area where we have reusable settings would be like in Windows Defender device control. right? And then there's a couple more that I can't remember off the top of my head, but we do have them in some places. And if you see them, make use of them. They're going to be a convenience for you, right? Then finally, I want to turn my attention to reports. And I don't think I'm going to have any data here, but I'll show you. We have 2 reports that will let you see all the elevations and what's happening and see the status on your device. And here I don't have any. Again, I don't know. I think I know why, but again, it's my lab tenant, so I expect in a production tenant it would be working just fine. So I don't have any data here to show, but these are the reports that we have, and they're good, right? They'll show you what you need to see. All right. So that said, let's actually go to our device and see this in action. So here I just have a Windows device, and I'm logged into this as a standard user. And as a standard user, I can launch the command prompt and do certain things like, who am I? Right? It tells me I'm the standard user, but this is absolutely not a full user account, right? So, and we'll see that. This is actually one of the reasons I chose to use the command prompt. So let me, oh, come on. Okay. So I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but I want to show this to you. There. So there's the directory for the Microsoft EPM agent. And then if I do a directory, you'll see that there's a folder for policies. So I can try to go there, and I'm not allowed to because I don't have the rights because I'm not an administrator, right? So I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, as I looked around at this, right, there's it's pretty simple demo. So I elevated the command prompt, and one thing I've given feedback, and the product groups, considering the feedback and thinking about what they would do, right? This is where I don't think the user elevation experience is optimum. And what I mean by that is my expectation is whenever I would right-click on the command prompt anywhere, I would see the option to elevate. I do not, right? So this is where you have to consider, do you want to automatically elevate? Because if I were enabled for endpoint privilege management, which I am, and I clicked on this as a user that is set to automatically elevate, it would elevate for me regardless. I wouldn't have to do anything special. But if I have to manually select to elevate, then I'm going to have to do something special. In this case, I need to locate where that option is. If I open File Location and right-click, then it is right here, Run with Elevated Access. So I want Run with Elevated Access to be everywhere the particular file is that I might want to run with elevated access, but right now it's only in select places like here, right? So when I click Run with Elevated Access, it'll do it. I'm going to have to provide a reason because that's what I've chosen as an option to do. And then I can continue, and it will go ahead and launch for me. So now command prompt is absolutely running as administrator, right? Absolutely running as administrator. So again, it's not hard to demo. It's pretty straightforward to actually go about demoing, but it's very powerful at the same time. Very, very powerful at the same time to at least have this capability, right? Okay, so I'm going to drop this down for a minute. I'm going to go ahead on the PowerPoint. And that's it. We're starting to wrap up the session, and we're going to finish by talking about some troubleshooting and tips and tricks. And this is where I'm going to return to the beginning, right? One of the nice things with endpoint privilege management is we give you the ability to get in and look at some things. So, for example, if I wanted to go look at endpoint privilege management, just this PC, look at program files, right? And then here's Microsoft. Wait, did I hit the right one? Should be. Oh, I'm blind. It's right there, right? There it is. So we see it. I can look at logs. So I can look at logs, no problem. I can open the log, whatever. And so the first thing is we have logs here, which is awesome that we have logs that we can look at and see how things are running. From anyone from a config manager background, we love our logs, and so we do have logs here that we can trace and see what's going on. The other thing is there's some interesting data in here that we can look at. Now, I am logged on as a standard user, so I cannot get to this, right? But I'll get to it in a minute. You saw me over here and be able to get to it, right? So let me just go on over here and navigate to it. There it is, right? So if I want to look at my policies, they're broken down into rules and settings. So if I want to actually see what the rules are, or sorry, in this case, settings, no, these are rules that are on the device, I can see them here. I can open them in Notepad. Right there they are, right? So it's a long string, or I can crunch it down with word wrap, but still, it's all here. I can see all of the data on the machine, or I can go back and do another directory. Oops, one more. Do another directory. I can go in and see some EPM tools. You know, whatever I want to see, we're all in here. So explore it, and you can see there's a README here, so you know we can pop that up, and you can see commandlets and such that you can use to test what's going on. We document them here, right? So a lot of useful stuff in here, useful for troubleshooting. Also, if I want to, I can open up Registry Editor, and there is an EPM agent registry key, right? And so we'll talk about some configuration details, product version, blah, blah, blah. And so there's probably some more that I haven't really taken the time to look for yet, maybe some event logs and you know, whatever, but that gives a good start at being able to troubleshoot things if things go wrong, or you want to check your settings or whatever, right? Okay. So starting to wrap up, some tips and tricks as we kind of finish. So we've talked about this, I think, already, but just make sure. So when you run with elevated access, either it's going to be automatic or it's going to be a right-click option on your menu. And if it's the right-click, I've shown you where it is. Again, we've already provided feedback to the product team that it would be awesome to have that right-click option elsewhere. But you do have the option to use automatic, so that should streamline things in many cases and make the user experience better. In terms of file elevation and elevation types, so we allow users, EPM by itself is going to allow users without admin privileges to run processes in the administrative context. So as we talked about at the beginning, when you create an elevation rule, that rule itself is going to allow endpoint privilege management to proxy the target of that rule to run with administrator privilege on the device. And so as a consequence, the application that you're targeting is going to have full admin capability on the device. That's what I said earlier. I use command prompt as a demo. Do not use that in production. Be very, very, very aware of any kind of side privileges that you're granting your user by elevation of a particular application, right? A task manager is another one I would think of. Be very careful about, and there's others as well. Client-side components. So I showed you those. To use endpoint privilege management, Intune, when it's enabled, is going to provision down a small set of components on the device. It's going to be in that Microsoft EPM folder under program files. And those are going to be the ones that receive elevation policies and they enforce them, right? So these are only provisioned whenever the settings policy is received. So turn on the settings policy to enable EPM. And after that, then the settings, the EPM software and all will be added to the device, right? Now, what about disabling and deprovisioning? So yeah, if you want to do that, as the component installs on the device, EPM can be disabled from within the elevation settings policy. Just turn it off. If you want to turn it back on again, you can, right? Use of the elevation settings policy is absolutely required to remove endpoint privilege management from a device, right? Now, what happens if you disable endpoint privilege management? Well, we'll immediately disable endpoint privilege management. We will not delete the files right now. We'll wait for 7 days. And after 7 days, if endpoint privilege management has not been re-enabled, then we'll take the files away. The reason we don't take them away right away is in case we don't want to get into a deprovisioning, reprovisioning kind of series of events or loop or whatever that can have potentially substantial impact on business operations and whatever, right? So we just leave them until we know for sure that you're not planning to turn them back on, but they are disabled. They absolutely are disabled. So we, again, have managed and unmanaged elevations. So another way to say this is user has to confirm the elevation, or it's an automatic elevation, right? Without yeah. Actually, that's, as I read that, that's not true. I'm realizing I misdefined that. So a managed elevation, sorry, let me redefine it, would be any elevation that endpoint privilege management facilitates. Managed elevations would include all elevations that EPM ends up facilitating for the standard user. This can include elevations that happen as the result of elevation rules or part of the default elevation action. Unmanaged elevations are different. They are all file elevations that happen without the use of endpoint privilege management, and these can happen when a user runs with administrative rights using the Windows default action of run as administrator. So I butchered those definitions. Apologies for that, but I did clear that up for you. We do fully support role-based access control with endpoint privilege management, and again, talked about the endpoint privilege management right-click menu option that we have for those user-confirmed kind of elevations through endpoint privilege management. And folks, that's really it, right? So if this sounds compelling to you, it's not difficult to set up. Just follow the examples I did if you want to. Again, don't use command prompt for production. But other than that, take a look at it, kick the tires. It's a tremendous feature. And we'll wrap the session there, and we will see you next time.